Welcome to Fast Politics, Evan Osnos.
Thank you, Molly Jong-Fast.
We're, you know, very excited to have you.
Very
The book,
excited to be here.
we
I
both have
appreciate it.
books coming out in June.
Yes.
Yours is a memoir. No, I'm just kidding. About
Let's
very,
swap. Should we do that? Do you want to
yes,
swap? And
I'll talk about your
right,
book and
exactly.
the memoir. So, the book is called The Have and the Have Yachts. Have I butchered the title or no?
No, you got it exactly right. And it is with my debt to both Hemingway, who wrote To Have and Have Not, and then the other guy who got there first. So it is an idea that resides in our consciousness, but I think it is a unique artifact of our time, the haves and have-yachts.
It's so wild to me to watch this cycle of backlash to backlash to backlash, right? Like financial inequality, pushback, some degree of making right or a little bit of a change, and then a re-election of Trump. Explain what the fuck is going on.
Well, you hit on the exact issue that interests me, which is that Americans have an almost uniquely complex and ambivalent relationship to big money, to wealth. I mean, we are both at some moments cynical about it and then fundamentally still aspirational. And I mean, this is not like an abstract idea. There was a Harris poll last year that showed that 60% of Americans believe that billionaires are making the country less fair, and 60% of Americans want to become billionaires themselves. It is, and very often it's the same people who have this oscillation of instincts. And I think you see that in our politics, where we are tugged back and forth. But I think what it obscures, frankly, and this is really the core of what interested me, was that we are living through utterly unprecedented times when it comes to the sheer scale and speed with which these fortunes have accumulated. If I can just give you one stat, it is that, as recently as 10 years ago, there was nobody on the planet who had $100 billion. The idea of a
Right.
centibillionaire was a non-thing. There are now at least 15 people who do. And to give you, I mean, take Elon Musk as an example. I mean, at the beginning of Trump's first term, he had about $10 billion. Today, as everybody knows, he has $400 billion. And if you talk to people who are scholars of not just scholars of the recent period, archaeologists who look at inequality back to the Neolithic period, they will tell you that it is very hard to find a period that is anything like what we're living through now. As somebody said to me, the people who built the pyramids were living in a less unequal society.
So I want to get to the fall of the Roman Empire because it's my fall of the Roman Empire. There's a lot of joking that goes around that this is a similar moment in America, that American history, history rhymes, and we are in a moment where the center cannot hold, right? That there's just too much inequality that we have, and again, maybe it's this idea of the printing press, the technology has catapulted us into a kind of dark ages, a kind of fraught time period. But I mean, is that your take on this? I mean, what do you think?
I
What do
think
you think about the instability?
Well, I think that the Roman analogy is more than casually important. Like, it is more than just that we sometimes throw up our hands and say, God, it feels like the fall of Rome. The great scholar of Rome, the late scholar Ramsay MacMullen at Yale, was once asked, he'd written acres on the subject of the fall of Rome. And he said, well, if you really ask me to boil this down, he says, the fall of Rome took 500 years, but it can be distilled into three words: fewer had more. The growth of radical inequality in both political and economic power is such a large and encompassing fact of our lives that it's almost like climate change, in the sense that you can go through the day without thinking about it, remembering periodically, oh yeah, this is happening and it probably will change the world I live in, but you can lose sight of it. And there are these moments, these little dramatic indications, these moments when it comes into our lives. And I think that the Musk-Trump joint venture is one of those times when we
Right.
have been suddenly aware of what the windfall in economics has meant for our politics and our political culture.
Elon Musk started out as pretty popular. Talk us through his devolution.
Yeah, I think he would be the first person to, in some ways, acknowledge that he was caught unaware by the collapse of his relationship with most of the public. I mean, he was, until not long ago, if you lined up a group of college students, you would very often hear them say, he is somebody who gives us inspiration about what this country can be. And his level of seclusion from actually the public, from real live experience, as indicated by things like him saying that, as many of us have heard, that the greatest flaw of Western civilization is empathy, or describing Social Security as a Ponzi scheme. They're really a tell about how far his life had become really divorced in a kind of lunar way from the lives of most other human beings. And I think this is like a theme that runs through my book, because over and over again, I would find myself in places that I know quite well. I mean, like Greenwich, Connecticut, which is where I grew up, is a place that has historically been kind of, in some sense connected to, but also disconnected from the rest of the country by the
Mhm.
forces of wealth. But in recent years, and Musk is just the most dramatic illustration of this, that the building of walls, both literally around people's estates, but also psychologically and emotionally and culturally, has become so profound that we are now living in an arrangement that is much closer to what it was like in, this is not an extravagant analogy, but like medieval Europe. There's a reason why people built castles. They built castles to defend themselves and their property against others. And Elon Musk is a living, breathing demonstration of what happens when you think that you understand how other people live, and you don't.
So interesting, because I think that's completely right. And I also wonder how much Elon Musk is a function of not having anyone around you who has ever told you the truth.
Oh, completely right. I mean, this is the great risk for authoritarians, either in private business or in public office, is that you become so insulated and comfortable. It's like this kind of amniotic fluid of agreement around you, that nobody who disagrees with you stays very long. And as a result, you make actually sometimes terrible mistakes. This is what's known as authoritarian backlash. And it's where you misjudge the public mood. If
Right.
you're the Shah of Iran, you host a giant party to celebrate your leadership a few months before the revolution rises up and removes you. And that's the pattern. And I think it's because there's nobody around him who can say it. Yeah, I'll give you one other fascinating example. I wrote a profile that's in this book of Mark Zuckerberg when he was in the period of kind of coming to terms with his vast new powers. And he had gone, you'll remember, Molly, on this like kind of weird tour of the United States where he was going out and
Mhm.
wanting to meet people
People.
and
Right.
people. And it got mocked because, as people put at the time, they said this really looks like a man who has landed, or a person who has landed on this planet and is like, bring your humans to me. I will see them and I will meet them and we will eat their things. And then and somebody who had worked for him told me, look, the reality was when he was on this tour, we could all see that this was really not going to work. And it looked kind of ridiculous, but there was nobody around him who could and would tell him that.
Right, 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 right.
Authoritarian backlash.
So, is it question, just to keep going with this theory, Putin's war with Ukraine, is that is that the same?
Very much so. Putin is the paradigmatic example of what the scholars call a sultanistic oligarch, which is a wonderful term, actually. And a sultanistic oligarch is somebody who is essentially agreed upon by the other elites or the other oligarchs in a society to let one among them rule. And it's because they all benefit from that. But the danger of becoming a sultanistic oligarch is that kind of seclusion and that kind of absence of any sort of critical thinking and judgment around you. And so everybody begins to say to you, well, it seems like invading Ukraine is a brilliant strategic move, sir. And we all saw those images of the boardroom where the oligarchs and the leaders of the intelligence community in Moscow were being briefed on this
Um,
plan, and there was uproarious applause. And that is it's a lesson that I think goes beyond just talking about our president or the Russian president, or it is really like a deep lesson in the problem of becoming too far ahead, too far isolated, and becoming too sure, to quote Kendrick Lamar, that you deserve it all. It's a risk. It'll blow
Right,
up on you. It'll
right.
blow.
And that's what we're seeing. So what we saw with Elon, I just want to get back to Elon for a minute because he is the most pertinent right now in
He
our
is.
American political world, is that his polling went down, the numbers at Tesla's profits were down 71%. Who even knew that could happen at a company?
Right.
They sold, well, I saw reporting that they sold 7,000 cars in Europe. I mean, okay. Do you think that these kind of come to Jesus moments where you see that the emperor really has no clothes, do you think they influence the zeitgeist, or do you think they're just sort of, I mean, the question we all have all the time is what breaks through?
Yeah. I think there's no question that this leaves a scar on the public mood. It's not just on
Mm.
Elon Musk individually. I think this is really important because when you try to understand essentially like where does this lead, Molly, which is, the question we're all trying to figure out, which is what happens when you have the Musk era? Where does that go? Where does
Mhm.
that take a country? We actually have a useful, almost hauntingly useful model, which is the end of the
Mm.
19th century, the beginning of the 20th century in this country, which is that, that was a time when you had these tycoons, the robber barons, as they were called during the Gilded Age, who were very, in many ways, Musk-like. I mean, Jay Gould, who was the Wall Street titan, Mark Twain used to say, "Look, Americans have always revered money, but Jay Gould made them kneel down and worship it." And in many ways, Musk is the modern incarnation of that. And what we saw in that period, in the late 19th century, was that there were these acts of just cartoonish extravagance, cartoonish sort of self-indulgence, the equivalent of having the many things that Musk has accumulated for himself, most significantly, perhaps, his family arrangement, which looks sultanistic in so many ways. That at the end of the 19th century, you had people hosting parties, for instance, in New York City, in a ballroom in Manhattan, where they brought horses into the ballroom, and they ate on horseback and drank champagne out of the saddlebags. And the country, regular Americans, were hearing about this, reading about it in the newspapers, and it was accumulating to the point of a breaking point where people would say, we can't go on like this. And that's what you had. That's really what gave way to the birth of the progressive era, and then ultimately to the New Deal, was this recognition on the part of the public, and ultimately on some of the elites, people like Teddy Roosevelt and then later Franklin Roosevelt, that this just, you can't go on this way or the country won't hold. I think that, Musk is pretty proficient at reading ultimately his role in the culture, and he'll figure out a way to kind of, get himself back in. I don't have any doubt about that. He'll find a way to rebuild some cultural cachet, which is now so very much in remission. But ultimately, I think that the bigger impact is really on that constant oscillation that we started with between fascination and revulsion with giant wealth. And he has almost single-handedly pushed the United States away from capitalism.
Ooh, that's interesting. Imagine being so rich that you turn Americans off of capitalism.
That's the
Uh,
pattern. That's history. It shows us it happens. And it takes ultimately other people to say to the Elon Musks of the world, if you carry on this way, this system, which has been ultimately so rewarding for them, is going to lose its public basis of support.
are you surprised that the oligarchs of this moment aren't more philanthropic? You think about Bill Gates with this comment that he made about Musk, where he said this is the richest man in the world taking away from the poorest children in the world. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, it's been quite noticeable in the philanthropy community. You hear about this generational, really, there's been a kind of generational split, which is that the early generation of mega wealth of the latter half of the 20th century and early 21st century, principally Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, or the iconic figures, that they made
But even the
large.
Waltons,
Yeah, they made a point, in a
huge.
sense, to put themselves in the tradition of Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, who believed you had to give some of your fortune, or in Gates and Buffett's case, the lion's share of your fortune back to the public through philanthropy. And there has been this real shift, though, since then. Really, it sort of started in the last 10 years or so, where, and this is not me making up making an abstraction. The data is quite clear on this, that the amount of money that people like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are giving to philanthropy is just simply much less than their predecessors like Buffett and Gates were. And the reason for this is that there is a theory that's become popular in Silicon Valley, which is that essentially your greatest act of philanthropy, putting that in quotes, is
Is
your
you
business. It's
talk
as
about
Musk.
high on your own supply. Go on.
I mean, that's, Musk's view is, as he said at one point, the greatest gift I can give to humanity is Tesla, to which others might say, but, what about a Musk Foundation? And I've watched it happen just over the last 10 years. This is a real shift.
I mean, the most incredible part of this is that the New York Times had a lot of reporting on the Musk Foundation where they were getting in trouble for not giving away what they are required by law to give away.
Totally true. I mean, and I thought the most interesting, revealing detail in the Times reporting on Musk's philanthropy is that one of the recipients of his philanthropic foundation in the early years was actually to a school that was located in his own house, in which 5 of the 14 students were his own children.
Yes. Many people are saying doing things for your kids is not actually philanthropy when you are the richest man in the world. We're laughing about this, but really we are laughing to keep from crying because it's so
Correct.
dark.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about, are there any, I have to talk about this because otherwise I'll go insane. There anything you're seeing when you, in this story of the haves and the have yachts, about some kind of positive
Yes.
move towards, so let's talk about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are some good news things that should be recognized and cultivated and celebrated, which is that there are some people who have really gone through a bit of a process over the last 10 or 15 years with the rise of Trump in our politics that has made them say that they recognize that the country is on some level on an unsustainable course. There is this organization called the Patriotic Millionaires, which I write about in this new piece in the New Yorker, in which these are folks who have thrived in the current disposition of power, the meaning that the tax code that benefits them, they have benefited from. But they are, in fact, some of the people who are standing up and saying, really, this is about taxes and wages. It's not complicated. They say, look, if wages had kept up with gains in productivity, if wages had kept up with the growth in the economy, wages today would be much higher than they were before. And, there's one guy in particular who I'm thinking of named John Driscoll, who was the CEO of a big healthcare company, who realized that, look, there is no way in which I can expect to have a successful business if the people who work for me are sleeping in their cars at night.
Yeah.
And so, and what's the encouraging thing here too is, Molly, that this is like any kind of culture. Culture moves, and sometimes it moves even faster than we expect. And so right now it feels as if we're in the season of plunder. We're in the season of the oligarchs who are exploiting this president to benefit themselves as much as they can. But it also can move fast, and we've seen it once before. We saw it in 1913 when you had the rise of elites in this country who recognized that to protect the country's future, you had to rein in excesses and abuses. And we're beginning to see some of that. And I think that the size of I'll just mention one other thing, which is that the size of the protests that Bernie Sanders has been getting this summer are really remarkable, because I interviewed a bunch of people at protests, at the Bernie Sanders rallies, and to a person, they had never been to one before. These are not diehard Bernie bros. These are people, in some cases, in a few cases actually, people who are quite sympathetic to Republican arguments, who said, I didn't vote for this. I didn't vote for what Trump is doing. And what we know from history, if there's one thing that listeners can take away who are trying to figure out what do we do as a people now to protect this country, the answer is sustained public pressure, that it matters to use your voice and to get up and say, no, this is not right, this is not fair, and this is not sustainable.